The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the forest floor into a muddy, slippery mess. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the rhythmic patter of raindrops hitting the ground. Somewhere in the distance, a crow cawed, its sharp cry cutting through the silence like a knife. And then, there was movement. A faint rustling sound came from the underbrush, barely audible over the rain. It was slow, deliberate, and accompanied by the soft, pained whimper of an animal. The sound grew louder, and soon, a figure emerged from the shadows. A German shepherd, its once glossy coat now matted with mud and blood. The dog's ribs pressed against its skin, and its movements were slow and labored, as if every step was a struggle. But what truly shocked the onlooker, a hiker who had stumbled upon the scene, was the dog's eyes. They were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and desperation, as if the dog had seen things no living creature should ever witness. The hiker froze, their heart pounding in their chest as they took in the sight before them. The dog stopped a few feet away, its body trembling. With exhaustion, it let out a low, mournful whine, its eyes locking onto the hikers. For a moment, it seemed like the dog was pleading for help, but then, as if remembering something terrible, it turned and began to limp away, disappearing into the dense underbrush. The hiker hesitated, their mind racing. What had happened to this dog? Why was it out here, alone and injured, in the middle of nowhere? And why did it seem so afraid? The questions swirled in their mind. But one thing was clear. This was no ordinary stray. There was a story here, a dark and twisted one, and the hiker couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stumbled upon something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined. The hiker, a woman named Sarah, had always been drawn to the forest. There was something about the way the trees seemed to whisper secrets to each other, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves, that made her feel at peace. But today, the forest felt different. It felt wrong. She had been hiking for hours, her boots sinking into the muddy ground with each step, when she heard the sound. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then she heard it again, a soft, pained whimper that sent a chill down her spine. She followed the sound, her heart pounding in her chest until she saw the dog. It was a German shepherd, its coat a patchwork of mud and blood, its body trembling with exhaustion. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight before her. The dog's eyes were wide, filled with a mixture of fear and desperation, and its movements were slow and labored, as if every step was a struggle. Sarah knelt down, her hands trembling as she reached out to the dog. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The dog flinched, its body tensing as if expecting a blow. Sarah's heart ached at the sight, and she slowly withdrew her hand, giving the dog space. She could see the fear in its eyes, the way it trembled at the slightest movement. This dog had been through something terrible, and Sarah knew she had to help. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a water bottle, pouring some into her cupped hand. The dog's ears twitched, and it sniffed the air cautiously before taking a hesitant step forward. Sarah held her breath, her heart pounding as the dog approached, its movements slow and deliberate. Finally, the dog reached her hand and began to drink, its tongue lapping at the water with a desperation that broke Sarah's heart. She could feel the dog's breath against her skin, warm and quick, and she could see the way its body trembled with exhaustion. But then, just as quickly as it had approached, the dog pulled away, its eyes wide with fear once more. It let out a low, mournful whine and began to limp away, disappearing into the dense underbrush. Sarah's heart ached as she watched the dog go, her mind racing with questions. What had happened to this poor creature? Why was it so afraid? And why did it seem like it was hiding from something, or someone? She knew she couldn't just leave the dog out here, alone and injured. She had to help. But as she stood there, the rain falling around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Sarah stood there for a moment, her mind racing as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. The dog's fear, its injuries, the way it had pulled away from her, it all pointed to something terrible. She knew she had to find out more. She began to follow the dog's tracks, her boots sinking into the muddy ground with each step. The rain continued to fall, making it difficult to see, but Sarah pressed on, her determination unwavering. She had to find the dog, had to help it. As she walked, she noticed something strange. Drag marks in the mud, as if something heavy had been pulled through the forest. Her heart pounded as she followed the marks, her mind racing with possibilities. What had happened here? And who, or what, had caused it? The drag marks led her to a small clearing, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. In the center of the clearing was a large rusted cage, its door hanging open. The ground around the cage was torn up, as if there had been a struggle, and there were dark stains on the ground that Sarah didn't want to think about. She approached the cage cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. The cage was empty, but there were signs that it had been occupied recently. A torn piece of fabric, a few strands of fur, and a small rusted dog tag lying in the mud. Sarah picked up the dog tag, her hands trembling as she wiped away the mud. The tag was old and worn, the name scratched out, but there was something about it that sent a chill down her spine. She turned it over in her hands, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what had happened here. And then she saw it. A small, almost imperceptible mark on the back of the tag. It was a symbol, one that Sarah recognized immediately. It was the mark of a dog-fighting ring. Her heart sank as the realization hit her. This dog, this poor, terrified creature, had been used for fighting. It had been abused, tortured, and then discarded like trash. And now, it was out here, alone and injured, trying to survive. Sarah's hands clenched into fists, her anger boiling over. How could anyone do something like this? How could they treat a living, breathing creature with such cruelty? She knew she had to help the dog, had to get it out of here into safety. But as she stood there, the rain falling around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She turned, her eyes scanning the trees. But there was nothing there. Just the rain, the mud, and the oppressive silence of the forest. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She had to focus. She had to find the dog. She began to search the area, her eyes scanning the ground for any sign of the dog. And then she saw it. A small, almost imperceptible trail of blood leading away from the cage. Her heart pounded as she followed the trail, her mind racing with possibilities. The trail led her deeper into the forest, the trees growing thicker and the underbrush more dense. The rain continued to fall, making it difficult to see, but Sarah pressed on, her determination unwavering. And then she saw it, the dog. It was lying in a small ditch, its body trembling with exhaustion. Its eyes were closed, and its breathing was shallow, but it was alive. Sarah's heart ached as she approached the dog, her hands trembling as she reached out to it. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing. "It's okay. I'm here to help." The dog's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, it seemed to recognize her. It let out a soft whine, its body trembling as it tried to move, closer to her. Sarah's heart swelled with emotion as she gently picked up the dog, cradling it in her arms. It was so light, so fragile, and she could feel its heart beating rapidly against her chest. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You're safe now. I've got you." But as she stood there, the rain falling around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. That somewhere, out there in the forest, someone, or something, was watching them. And what happened next would shock everyone. Sarah stood in the rain, the trembling German shepherd, cradled in her arms. The dog's shallow breaths warmed her chest, but the cold, creeping feeling of being watched sent shivers down her spine. She scanned the dense forest, her eyes darting between the shadows of the trees. The rain muffled most sounds, but she could have sworn she heard the faint crunch of footsteps in the distance. "It's okay," she whispered to the dog, though her voice trembled. "We're getting out of here." She adjusted her grip on the dog and began to make her way back toward the trail. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closing in around her like silent sentinels. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made her heart race. She quickened her pace, her boots slipping in the mud as she tried to put as much distance as possible between herself and the clearing with the rusted cage. But then, she heard it. A low, guttural growl that didn't come from the dog in her arms. It was deeper, more menacing, and it sent a jolt of fear through her. She froze, her breath catching in her throat, and turned slowly toward the sound. There, just a few yards away, stood a figure. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by the hood of a dark raincoat. He stood perfectly still, his eyes fixed on her, and in his hand he held a length of chain, its links glinting in the dim light. Sarah's heart pounded as she took a step back, her grip tightening on the dog. The man didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was enough to make her blood run cold. She could feel the dog tense in her arms, a low whine escaping its throat as it buried its face against her chest. "Stay back," Sarah said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'm not afraid of you." The man tilted his head, as if amused by her defiance, and took a step forward. The chain in his hand rattled ominously, and Sarah's mind raced. She had to get out of here, had to get the dog to safety. But how? The man was blocking the path, and she was deep in the forest, miles from help. She glanced around, searching for an escape route, and her eyes landed on a narrow trail leading off to the left. It was overgrown and barely visible, but it was her only chance. Without hesitation, she turned and bolted down the trail, the dog clutched tightly to her chest. The man let out a sharp whistle, and suddenly, the forest came alive with movement. Sarah could hear footsteps behind her, heavy and fast, and the sound of voices shouting in the distance. Her heart pounded as she ran, her boots slipping in the mud, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The dog whimpered in her arms, its body trembling, with fear, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The trail twisted and turned, the trees closing in around her, and Sarah's legs burned with the effort of running through the mud and underbrush. She could hear the men behind her, their voices growing louder, and she knew she couldn't outrun them. She had to hide. She spotted a large fallen tree up ahead, its roots jutting out of the ground like gnarled fingers. Without thinking, she dove behind it, crouching low and pressing herself and the dog against the damp wood. She held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they could hear it. The footsteps grew closer, and Sarah could hear the men talking, their voices harsh and angry. "Where'd she go?" one of them growled. "She can't have gone far," another replied. "Find her. And the dog. The boss won't be happy if we lose it." Sarah's stomach churned at the words. The boss? Who were these people? And what did they want with the dog? She glanced down at the German shepherd, its eyes wide with fear, and felt a surge of protectiveness. She wouldn't let them take it. Not again. The men's footsteps grew closer, and Sarah held her breath, her body tense. She could see their boots through the gaps in the roots, could hear their heavy breathing as they searched the area. She clutched the dog tighter, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way out. And then, the dog did something unexpected. It let out a soft, almost imperceptible whine. its body trembling against hers. Sarah's heart sank as she realized what was about to happen. The men stopped, their boots crunching in the mud as they turned toward the sound. "Over here," one of them said, his voice low and menacing. Sarah's mind raced. She had to do something, had to distract them. She glanced around, her eyes landing on a large rock a few feet away. Without thinking, she grabbed it and hurled it as far as she could, the sound of it crashing through the underbrush echoing through the forest. The men turned toward the sound, their voices sharp as they shouted at each other to follow it. Sarah didn't wait. She stood up, the dog still clutched in her arms, and ran in the opposite direction, her legs burning with the effort. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the forest, her chest heaving as she collapsed against a tree. The dog whimpered softly, its body trembling against hers, and Sarah gently stroked its head, trying to calm it. "It's okay," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "We're safe now." But as she stood there, the rain falling around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't out of danger yet. The men were still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they found the dog. Sarah's cabin was small but warm, the fire in the hearth casting a golden glow over the room. She had brought the German Shepherd inside, wrapping it in a thick blanket and placing it by the fire. The dog was still trembling, its eyes wide with fear, but it didn't resist as Sarah gently cleaned its wounds and gave it water. She sat beside the dog, her hand resting lightly on its head, and spoke to it in a soft, soothing voice. "You're safe now," she said. "No one's going to hurt you anymore." The dog looked up at her, its dark eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. It let out a soft whine, its body trembling as it leaned into her touch. Sarah's heart swelled with emotion as she realized that, for the first time, the dog was starting to trust her. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the rusted dog tag she had found in the clearing. The name was still scratched out, but the symbol on the back was clear, a mark of cruelty and exploitation. Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she thought about what the dog had endured, the pain and fear it had experienced. "I won't let them hurt you again," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. "I promise." The dog let out a soft sigh, its body relaxing slightly as it rested its head on her lap. Sarah gently stroked its fur, her mind racing as she tried to piece together what had happened. Who were those men? And why were they so desperate to get the dog back? She knew she had to find out more, had to uncover the truth about the dog's past. But for now, all that mattered was keeping it safe. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Sarah sat with the dog, her hand resting on its head, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. The dog was safe, and for the first time, in what felt like forever, so was she. But as she sat there, the rain falling outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. That somewhere, out there in the darkness, someone was still looking for the dog, and what happened next would change everything. Sarah sat by the fire, her hand resting on the German Shepherd's head, her mind racing with questions. The dog had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, its body twitching occasionally as if haunted by nightmares. The storm outside had subsided, leaving behind an eerie silence that only amplified Sarah's unease. She couldn't shake the feeling that the men from the forest were still out there, searching for the dog. She had to act fast. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number of a local animal rescue organization she had volunteered with in the past. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Sarah? It's been a while. What's going on?" It was Mark, the director of the rescue. "Mark, I need your help," Sarah said, her voice urgent. "I found a German Shepherd in the woods. He's been abused, and there are people after him. I think he was part of a dogfighting ring." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you safe?" Mark asked, his tone serious. For now, Sarah replied, glancing at the dog. But I don't know how long that will last. These men, they're dangerous. Okay, stay where you are. I'll send a team to your location. We'll get the dog out of there and make sure you're both safe. Sarah thanked him and hung up, her heart still racing. She knelt beside the dog, gently stroking its fur. Hang in there, buddy, she whispered. Help is on the way. But as she sat there waiting, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, the rumble of an engine, growing louder with each passing second. She rushed to the window and peered outside. A black SUV was pulling up to her cabin, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized who it was. The men had found her. She grabbed the dog's blanket and wrapped it tightly around him, lifting him into her arms. We have to go, she whispered, her voice trembling. Now. She moved quickly but quietly, slipping out the back door just as the front door burst open. The sound of heavy footsteps and angry voices filled the cabin as Sarah ran into the woods. The dog clutched tightly to her chest. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her legs burning with the effort of running through the mud and underbrush. Behind her, she could hear the men shouting, their voices growing louder as they gave chase. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of a way out. She couldn't outrun them, not with the dog in her arms. She had to hide. She spotted a dense thicket up ahead and dove into it, crouching low and pressing herself and the dog against the damp ground. She held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure they could hear it. The men's footsteps grew closer, and Sarah could hear them cursing as they searched the area. She clutched the dog tighter, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way out. And then, she heard it. The sound of sirens in the distance. The men froze, their voices sharp as they shouted at each other to retreat. Sarah's heart leaped as she realized what was happening. Mark had called the police. The men turned and ran, their footsteps fading into the distance as the sirens grew louder. Sarah let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with relief. She stood up, the dog still clutched in her arms, and made her way back to the cabin. As she reached the clearing, she saw the flashing lights of police cars and the rescue team's van. Mark was there, his face filled with concern as he rushed toward her. Sarah, are you okay? He asked, his eyes scanning her for injuries. Sarah nodded, her voice choked with emotion. We're okay. But the dog, he needs help. Mark gently took the dog from her arms, his expression softening as he looked at the trembling creature. We'll take care of him, he said. You did good, Sarah. You saved his life. Sarah watched as the rescue team loaded the dog into the van, her heart swelling with relief. But as she stood there, the cold night air biting at her skin, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. That somewhere, out there in the darkness, someone was still looking for the dog. The next few days were a blur of activity. The dog, whom Sarah had named Max, was taken to the rescue's facility, where he received medical treatment and round-the-clock care. Sarah visited him every day, sitting by his side and speaking to him in a soft, soothing voice. At first, Max was wary, his body tense and his eyes filled with fear, but slowly, as the days passed, he began to relax. He would lean into Sarah's touch, his tail wagging faintly as she stroked his fur. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything to Sarah. She spent hours researching dogfighting rings, determined to uncover the truth about Max's past. She learned about the brutal world of illegal dogfighting, where animals were bred and trained for violence, their lives worth nothing more than the money they could make for their owners. The more she learned, the more determined she became to bring Max's abusers to justice. One evening, as she sat with Max in the facility's recovery room, she received a call from Mark. Sarah, we found something, he said, his voice filled with urgency. "A news article from a few years ago. It's about a dogfighting ring that was busted in the area. One of the dogs they rescued was a German shepherd named Titan. The description matches Max." Sarah's heart raced as she listened. "What happened to Titan?" she asked. "He was adopted by a family, but they reported him missing a few months later. The police never found him." Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she realized what had happened. Max Titan had been stolen, forced back into the world of dogfighting. And now, he was finally free. She looked down at Max, his eyes filled with trust as he rested his head on her lap. "You're safe now," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I won't let anyone hurt you again." One night, as Sarah sat with Max in the recovery room, he had a nightmare. His body thrashed violently, his legs kicking out as if he were running from something. Sarah gently shook him awake, her heart aching as she saw the fear in his eyes. "It's okay, Max," she whispered, her voice soft and soothing. "You're safe now. I'm here." Max looked up at her, his body trembling as he pressed his nose against her hand. And then, for the first time, he rested his head against her chest, his breathing slow and steady. Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she realized what had just happened. Max had finally let his guard down. He trusted her. She gently stroked his fur, her heart swelling with emotion. "You're not just a dog, Max," she whispered. "You're a survivor, and I'm so proud of you." As the days turned into weeks, Max continued to heal, both physically and emotionally. Sarah visited him every day, her bond with him growing stronger with each passing moment. But as she sat with him one evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger wasn't over. She had found a name in the news article, a man connected to the dogfighting ring. He had never been caught, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if he was still out there, looking for Max. She looked down at Max, his eyes filled with trust as he rested his head on her lap. "Whoever did this to you," she whispered, "they weren't expecting you to survive, but you did, and you're stronger than they'll ever be." As the fire crackled in the hearth, Sarah sat with Max, her hand resting on his head, and felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. Max was safe, and for the first time in what felt like forever, so was she. But as she sat there, the rain falling outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. That somewhere, out there in the darkness, someone was still looking for Max, and what happened next would change everything. The end.